Two photographs taken 40 years apart. And yet, the face is identical. In 1977, Evelyn Hartman walked out of her home and vanished. In 2021, she's captured again in a bustling train station, unchanged, untouched by time. What could keep someone frozen like this? And what secrets would a mother sacrifice everything to protect? On a crisp October morning in 1977, the town of Oakridge woke beneath a pewter sky, and the maple leaves along Maple Street rustled like quiet paper, while inside a modest two-story colonial, the Hartman home exhaled a gentle warmth that smelled of cinnamon oatmeal and fresh coffee. Evelyn Hartman moved through her kitchen with the calm certainty of practiced routine, smoothing a wrinkle from the tablecloth and aligning the spoons until they formed a neat silver constellation beside the bowls. She had already packed a small lunch for her 4-year-old daughter, Stella, a sandwich cut on the diagonal the way Stella liked, a shiny apple polished against a dish towel, and 2 molasses cookies that waited obediently in wax paper. A radio in the front room murmured a morning orchestra program at low volume, so the strings felt like a hush across the floorboards, and from the hallway the faint scent of lavender rose from the sweater Evelyn wore over her navy dress. She washed dishes with steady hands and set each plate to drip on the rack, then dried them, then stacked them in their places, taking the extra second to trace the edge of a saucer as if sealing the moment with attention. The curtains she had sewn herself hung perfectly even, their stitched hems catching the soft light that pooled across the sink. And outside the window, the geraniums she tended in terracotta boxes shivered in the light wind. In the entryway, her coat remained on its peg despite the chill, and on the bedroom dresser, her small wooden jewelry box stayed, closed with the wedding band resting inside where she had set it the night before. The house carried the gentle order of a life carefully kept, as though every object knew its part in a quiet play and stood patiently waiting for the next cue. She checked the mailbox near the front steps and found a slim stack of envelopes, just bills and a grocery circular, which she set on the hall table beneath the glass dish that caught keys and spare buttons. The milkman made his delivery and later would remember the porch as entirely still, the bottles arranged like little crystal towers beside the door, no curtain twitching and no figure passing behind the frosted glass. A neighbor walking her terrier saw the Hartman garden as if staged for a photograph, mums blazing in careful rows and a rake leaned against the fence, but no one moving in the yard. The clock over the mantel ticked with faithful patience, and Stella hummed to herself on the living room rug while arranging wooden animals in a parade that moved from the sofa to the window and back again. At 9:30 in the morning, the lunch on the counter remained untouched under its square of wax paper, a small promise of midday that never arrived. The front door was unlocked the way it often was on weekday mornings in Oakridge, a town that trusted its quiet, and the back gate sat latched, its paint a little chipped from summer sun. The kitchen looked exactly as a kitchen should look after a tidy morning. The towels folded, the sponge wrung, the light reflecting off a spotless sink as if time had paused to admire the shine. Robert Hartman left his position at the local bank around noon to stop home, expecting a quick hello and perhaps a note on the table reminding him to pick up sugar because sugar had been running low all week. He opened the door to a stillness so complete that the radio's soft melody felt like it belonged to another house, drifting from a room one step out of reality. He called Evelyn's name, and the sound dissolved gently into the hallway. And then Stella answered from the living room with a simple "Daddy, here I am." But there was no other reply. Robert checked the kitchen and found the lunch as it had been left, the plate racked dry, the counters gleaming, the little floral apron hanging from its hook like a flag with no wind. He looked for a note on the table, opened the mail, and found nothing except envelopes with windows that stared back blankly. And when he checked the bedroom, he saw the jewelry box closed and the coat still hanging as if it had never considered leaving. The windows were latched, the back door secured, the garden quiet except for a wind chime that gave a single polite ring and then waited. He felt a tightening under his ribs that was not fear exactly, but a kind of hollow pressure, as though the house had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale, and he stepped carefully through each room as if he might bump into an answer. He phoned the sheriff's office and kept his voice steady even as he traced the same loop from hallway to kitchen to living room and back again, naming small details because small details were all he had. Sheriff Walter Briggs arrived with 2 deputies who had known the Hartmans for years, and they walked the home with respectful attention, notepads balanced in their palms, asking gentle questions that landed like pebbles on still water. They confirmed what Robert already knew, that nothing was out of place, that no overturned chair or tossed drawer hinted at confusion, and that the only visible absence in the house was Evelyn herself. The deputies spoke with neighbors who stood on their porches holding elbows against the breeze, and people answered with careful honesty that they had seen nothing unusual except the usual, which was to say nothing at all. Afternoon slid toward evening while volunteers gathered with flashlights and thermoses, a familiar rhythm in a small town that understood how to look together even when it did not know exactly what it sought. Searchers moved in tidy lines along the walking paths near the creek and among the leaf piles at the edge of the ball fields, calling Evelyn's name in ordinary voices that never rose to alarm, only to hope. The sky darkened to a velvet tone and the lights of Oakridge clicked on one by one, marking streets like constellations that had learned the map of the town by heart. At home, Robert kept Stella close and made her a simple supper that tasted like being steady when one is not. And he placed a small portion on a plate at the far side of the table, because tradition felt like a promise kept. After he tucked Stella into bed, he returned to the front room and set a lamp in the window, the bulb casting a soft amber oval on the glass that could be seen from the street like a welcome always on. He sat with the radio low and listened for the sound of a car door or footsteps on the path or the particular rattle of their mail slot that always announced late delivery, and the house hummed with quiet and waited with him. The next morning, the hardware store ran a stack of flyers from its old copier, the page showing Evelyn smiling in the Hartman garden beneath a caption with a phone number, the ink not quite even at the edges, but clear enough for purpose. Sheriff Briggs established a small table in the church hall where volunteers signed in and received maps with pencil marks along trails, and the town librarian organized scrap paper into tidy folders because details deserved a place to live. Phone calls arrived at the sheriff's desk from neighboring towns and from kind strangers who had read a headline on their breakfast counters, and each tip was logged and each call was returned, and then the day went on. Robert kept the house as if it were a watch that needed regular winding, dusting the shelves and folding laundry and smoothing the bedspread on the side of the bed that remained unwrinkled. He returned to work in the mornings and spoke with customers in the precise, polite rhythm required by deposits and withdrawals, then took his lunch at home so Stella would see his face in the doorway and know that something in the day still made sense. He watered the geraniums because he could do that, and he clipped a brown leaf because he could do that too, and he wore his wedding band and kept Evelyn's in the small wooden box where it gleamed like a held breath. Stella asked questions in the bright, straightforward way children do, and Robert answered everyone with kindness, explaining that sometimes people are not where we expect them to be. And then we look, and we keep looking, and we stay ready. The church brought casseroles and pies and first-grade art projects that said, "We love you" in crooked printed letters, and the congregation learned to sit beside Robert without reaching for theories, because comfort does not require theories. Within weeks, the official search slowed the way a song does when the record approaches its final groove, not stopping completely, but moving more carefully, with measured steps and well-kept notes. Sheriff Briggs checked in every few days and left business cards with a blue line of ink across the back where he had written his home number, because availability can be a kind of mercy. Robert started a small notebook in the top drawer of his desk, where he wrote times and observations and ideas that arrived at midnight when the house felt too quiet. Not because he had solved anything, but because writing kept the air from collapsing. Autumn tipped toward winter and the world changed colors around the Hartman home. Yet inside, the rooms carried on with their soft order. The radio's still there, the apron hook still there, the lunchbox washed and ready on the shelf. The lamp in the window remained a gentle beacon that belonged both to the present day and to a promise about tomorrow. And passers-by learned to glance toward it and feel something in their chest settle. In the bank window, a small card invited anyone with information to step forward, and the grocery store pin board held copies of the flyer beneath thumbtacks shaped like stars, because even simple shapes can hold hope. The local paper printed updates in paragraphs that stayed respectful and careful with language, because the story at its heart was about a person beloved by a family and a town that refused to forget. Stella began drawing pictures of a front path with someone walking up it, and Robert kept every drawing in a neat folder with a little label that read home, because labels help even when they cannot resolve the mystery behind them. When snow finally came, it lay softly along the fence rails like folded blankets, and the house looked exactly as it had looked the winter before, except for the sense that the air itself was listening. Robert kept the porch swept because he believed a swept porch sends a message to anyone finding their way back. A message that says you are expected and your place is waiting. Some evenings he stood at the window with the lamp and imagined the click of a latch and the sound of a familiar step in the hall. And he let the imagining exist, because refusing it would not bring answers any faster. Stella sometimes fell asleep on the sofa with a book open across her knees, and Robert would carry her to bed and think about how quiet can be both a balm and a challenge. The neighbors never stopped waving from sidewalks the way small towns do. And when they asked if there was any news, they learned to use a voice that made the question feel like a hand at the elbow. The calendar pages turned, yet the house continued its patient breathing, and the garden would sleep, and then wake, and then sleep again, because the seasons are very good at their jobs. Through it all, the Hartman home kept a place for Evelyn at the table and on the bookshelf and in the tidy sideways space beside the entryway mirror, not as a shrine, but as a living arrangement where a missing presence still has room. If you stood on the sidewalk at dusk, you could see the lamplight resting on the window pane like a promise with edges of gold. And you might think that a house can hold a note the way a violin does, long after the bough has passed. People would say that Oakridge learned patience that year, and they would mean a particular kind of patience, the kind that treats each day with care even when answers do not hurry. And so the first chapter of the Hartman mystery settled into the town's careful keeping, not with alarms or pronouncements, but with a steady resolve that began with a family, a lamp in a window, and a home that refused to forget. In the weeks following Evelyn Hartman's disappearance, Oakridge became a town suspended between grief and disbelief, where neighbors left porch lights burning at night and strangers searched wooded trails with lanterns. Robert Hartman answered endless questions from the sheriff. Replaying the last morning, he saw his wife as though clarity might surface in the repetition. He clung to details, the way she smoothed Stella's hair, the cardigan she wore, the faint scent of lavender from her perfume, as if those fragments could anchor her return. But as weeks became months, official searches slowed, headlines shrank, and the story of Evelyn drifted into the realm of whispered lore. In the Hartman home, however, her absence was everywhere. pressing into the corners of each room. Robert refused to treat her belongings as relics. Her dresses remained in the closet, untouched and perfectly arranged. Her cookbook stayed open on the kitchen shelf, her notes scribbled in the margins in neat cursive. The garden she had nurtured still bloomed each spring, Robert tending it with steady devotion, never allowing weeds to overtake the soil she once cared for. And every evening, he placed a lamp in the front window, a silent signal to Evelyn. "Come home, we're waiting." Stella, just 4 years old, grew up in that space of waiting. She would press her face to the window after school, convinced that her mother's familiar figure would appear at the end of the walkway. Robert tried to answer her questions gently, explaining that sometimes people are lost and sometimes it takes time to find them. But the truth that no one knew where Evelyn was or why she had vanished hovered over them like a shadow that stretched longer with every passing year. By the mid-1980s, Stella was a teenager, her resemblance to Evelyn growing stronger with each birthday. Teachers, shopkeepers, even distant cousins would sometimes stop mid-conversation, struck by the echoes of Evelyn's face in Stella's expressions. Stella herself wrestled with the weight of being a living reminder of the woman everyone still wondered about. She began to pore through her mother's recipe cards, her sewing patterns, her journals, searching for clues in the ordinary details of her life. But nothing explained the sudden silence of October 1977. Robert never remarried. Though friends encouraged him to move forward, he insisted his vows remained intact. "How can I say goodbye," he would tell them, "when she might walk through the door tomorrow?" He raised Stella with steadfast patience, braiding her hair before school, teaching her to ride a bike, attending every recital and graduation. But always, behind his smile, there was an unspoken ache, a quiet vacancy where Evelyn should have been. In 1992, when Stella was in her 20s, she used part of a small inheritance from her grandmother to hire a private investigator. For 6 months, he scoured archives, interviewed retired officers, and retraced old leads. He found conflicting accounts, false sightings, rumors that Evelyn had been seen boarding a bus, or that she had run away with someone. But each possibility unraveled under scrutiny, and the investigator closed his files with an apology Stella would never forget. Sometimes the trail just disappears. The years marched on. Robert grew older, his hair turning silver, his hands stiff from years of clockmaking at his shop downtown. He continued to keep Evelyn's side of the closet untouched, continued to light the window lamp each night, even as Stella became an adult with a family of her own. In 2001, Robert passed quietly in his sleep, leaving Stella with a drawer full of unsent letters he had written to Evelyn over the decades, letters filled with longing, updates about Stella, and unshaken belief that one day she would return. Stella carried that torch. She became a teacher, married a kind man named Daniel Wilson, and raised 3 children, but the absence of her mother shaped everything. She marked each October with a visit to the old Hartman home, standing silently in the yard as though listening for Evelyn's footsteps. She renewed missing persons filings every few years, checked databases as technology advanced, and even appeared on a television program about unsolved mysteries in the 1980s. Every time, hope flickered and then dimmed again. By the 2010s, Stella was in her 80s, living in Manhattan near her grandchildren. Her apartment was filled with photographs, family milestones, travels, birthdays, but always one framed image of Evelyn in 1976, auburn hair pinned, her smile forever young. To outsiders, Evelyn Hartman was a story long forgotten, a name buried in Oakridge archives. But to Stella, the mystery had never closed. For 43 years, she had lived in the negative space her mother left behind. A daughter defined as much by what she had lost as by what she had built. And then, in the spring of 2021, a single photograph would collapse those decades of uncertainty into a moment that felt like stepping into another world. By the spring of 2021, Stella Wilson was 88 years old, her once auburn hair now silver, her posture slowed by the years, but her mind sharp with memory. She had long since retired from teaching, living in a modest Manhattan apartment surrounded by shelves of books and framed photographs of her children and grandchildren. Among them all, one image always stood out. Her mother, Evelyn Hartman, smiling in a garden in 1976, frozen at 23. Though Stella had been only 4 when Evelyn vanished, she had memorized that face, tracing its lines with her eyes for a lifetime. She often told her grandchildren that when you grow up with absence, you cling to the fragments that remain. Her granddaughter, Anna Wilson, now 32 and a curator at a small New York gallery, had always shared her fascination with the mystery. As a child, she had listened wide-eyed as Stella told stories about Evelyn, about the day she vanished, about the unanswered questions that hung over their family. In college, Anna had even written papers about unsolved disappearances, weaving her great-grandmother's story into her research. Now, in her professional life, she worked with photography exhibitions, drawn to the way images could capture not only moments, but also truths hidden within them. One rainy Saturday, she invited Stella to the opening of an exhibition she had helped curate. The gallery was brightly lit, white walls lined with large black and white photographs by a renowned street photographer named David Lang. The series, titled Urban Anonymity, focused on crowds in public spaces, bustling streets, train stations, plazas, where individuality seemed to vanish in the blur of motion. Anna guided her grandmother through the rooms, pointing out compositions, explaining the artistic choices, eager to share her world. Stella listened politely, sipping from a plastic flute of champagne, though her attention wavered. Modern photography was not her passion, but time with Anna was something she cherished. As they moved into the final section, the photographs shifted to images of Grand Central Terminal. Commuters rushing in all directions blurred into rivers of motion. Tourists gazed at the celestial ceiling, and couples embraced in the crowd. One image, larger than the rest, captured the cavernous station at its busiest. Amid the blur of travelers, one figure stood unervingly still, perfectly in focus, as though the chaos of the station had parted around her. Stella's breath caught in her throat. The figure was a woman, standing just off-center, her gaze tilted upward toward the famous clock. She wore a modern black coat over a gray dress, a red scarf looped elegantly at her neck. But none of that mattered. What mattered was her face. It was Evelyn. Stella's hands trembled, and the champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor, though she hardly noticed. Her chest tightened, as if the air had been stolen from the room. For a moment, the gallery around her disappeared, and all she could see was the woman in the photograph, unchanged since 1977. The same hazel eyes, the same high cheekbones, even the small mark near her left eyebrow. Details Stella had studied in old photographs for decades. She hadn't aged a single day. "Grandma, are you all right?" Anna hurried to her side, concerned by her sudden stillness. Stella could only whisper, her voice cracking under the weight of recognition. "That's her, that's my mother." Patrons nearby exchanged uncertain glances, unsure if Stella was confused or overwhelmed. But Stella was certain this wasn't resemblance, this wasn't coincidence. It was Evelyn Hartman, alive, unchanged, impossibly standing in the heart of modern New York City. When introduced to David Lang, the photographer, Stella explained with trembling hands who she believed the woman was. To her surprise, he did not dismiss her as delusional. He admitted he had no memory of the individual subjects in his images. His goal had been capturing the crowd as a whole. But her certainty moved him, and he offered her a high-resolution copy of the photograph to examine. He even promised to review the hundreds of shots from that day to see if the woman appeared in more than one frame. That night, back in her apartment, Stella opened the image on her computer, enlarging it again and again. She compared every feature with the digitized photographs of Evelyn she had saved years before. The results were undeniable. The facial proportions, the curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the faint scar on the chin. Everything matched. It was not a look-alike. For Stella, the discovery was both electrifying and terrifying. Electrifying because it meant Evelyn might still be out there, that she had never truly been lost. Terrifying because it defied reason, history, and the natural order of time itself. In one moment, a mystery dormant for 4 decades had reignited, more urgent and impossible than ever before. And Stella knew she could not ignore it. The search for Evelyn Hartman was about to begin again. Stella Wilson knew she couldn't face the mystery alone. For decades she had sifted through files, followed rumors, and contacted officials, but now, at 88, she needed a professional. Her children, cautious and protective, urged her to let it go, but she insisted. And so she turned to Thomas Greer, a private investigator with a reputation for thoroughness and discretion. Greer, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a background in law enforcement, had seen more than his share of unusual cases. When Stella showed him the photograph from Grand Central Terminal, he studied it silently for several minutes. Then, looking from the faded images of Evelyn in 1976 to the modern print, he let out a slow breath. "I've been doing this for 25 years, he said, and I've never seen a match this exact. Not over 4 decades apart. Greer ran facial recognition software, overlaying the images. The program gave a 97% match, virtually unheard of for anything but identical photographs. Stella's family remained skeptical, but Greer approached the case with calm determination. He began at Grand Central, speaking with station security and reviewing surveillance footage from the day David Lang had taken his photographs. The grainy video showed crowds moving quickly through the terminal, but for a moment, there she was, the woman in the red scarf. She purchased a ticket at a kiosk, moved toward track 19, and then disappeared into the tide of commuters. Greer's pulse quickened. This was more than a still image. She was real, and she had been there. The next step was identifying where she had gone. He questioned station employees, showing them the photograph. Most shook their heads, but one ticket collector paused. "Yes," he said slowly, "I remember her. Polite, old-fashioned, paid in cash. She bought a one-way ticket to Millfield, upstate." The detail struck Greer as odd. Most travelers used cards, not bills, especially for longer trips. Within days, Greer drove north to Millfield, a small town nestled in rolling hills, its main street lined with antique shops and cafes. He carried the photograph in his pocket, showing it discreetly at the diner, the library, the post office. At the diner, a waitress in her 50s glanced at the picture and nodded without hesitation. "Oh, that's Elizabeth Crane," she said. "Moved here maybe 7 months ago. Keeps to herself, but everyone notices her. She looks timeless, you know." The word sent a chill through Greer. Timeless. He pressed for more details. Elizabeth Crane lived alone in the old Whitaker house on Elm Street, a sprawling Victorian with pale blue siding and white trim. She paid for it in cash, which raised quiet curiosity in a town where everyone knew everyone's business. She volunteered twice a week at the local library, working with historical archives. She attended church on Sundays, polite but distant, as though she belonged to another era. Greer phoned Stella immediately from the diner's payphone, his voice low but urgent. "I think I've found her. At least, I've found the woman from the photograph. She's living under the name Elizabeth Crane." There was a long silence on the other end, and then Stella whispered, "I need to see her." Greer hesitated, knowing the risks of confronting someone without preparation. But Stella's tone brooked no argument. She had waited 44 years for answers. She wasn't waiting another day. The following morning, they drove together to Millfield. The streets were quiet, lined with maples shedding gold and crimson leaves. As they turned onto Elm Street, the Whitaker house came into view. Elegant and still, the wraparound porch adorned with flower boxes of red geraniums. Stella's breath caught. The same flowers Evelyn had planted faithfully in Oakridge decades earlier. She gripped Greer's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. They parked across the street, watching the house. A curtain shifted in an upstairs window, though it could have been the wind. Stella sat frozen, unable to move, overwhelmed by the thought of what awaited behind the door. Greer waited patiently, letting her gather strength. Finally, she nodded. "I'm ready." They crossed the street, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. Stella's hand trembled as she reached for the door, but before she could knock, it opened. And there she was, standing in the doorway, auburn hair softly curled, hazel eyes wide with recognition. She looked exactly as she had in 1977, not a line, not a year older. Stella's world tilted on its axis as the woman spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "I've been expecting you." For a long moment, time itself seemed to stop at the doorway of the Whitaker house. Stella Wilson, her hands trembling with age, stood staring into the face of the woman she had been waiting to see for 44 years. Evelyn Hartman looked exactly as she had the morning she vanished in 1977, her auburn hair catching the light, her hazel eyes warm but cautious, her cardigan draped neatly over a simple blue dress. The sight was so impossible that Stella felt her knees weaken, her breath shallow. "Mother," she whispered, the word cracking in her throat, fragile as glass. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and her lips curved into a trembling smile. "Hello, Stella," she said softly, her voice carrying the accent and cadence of a world long past. The sound of it shattered the decades of silence that had haunted Stella's life. For one heartbeat, daughter and mother simply stood there, frozen by the enormity of the moment. Then, with a sob that broke the air, Stella stepped forward and collapsed into her mother's arms. The embrace was surreal. Stella, wrinkled and bent by time, holding the mother who looked younger than she did. The paradox of it all made her dizzy, yet the warmth, the scent of lavender still clinging faintly to Evelyn's cardigan, left no doubt. This was no dream, no illusion. It was her. Greer, the investigator, stood quietly to the side, giving them space, though he could not hide the astonishment in his eyes. Inside, the house was a peculiar mixture of past and present. A vintage Philco radio sat beside a modern flat-screen television. Hand-embroidered doilies adorned a contemporary sofa. Books from the 1930s shared shelf space with recent bestsellers. It was as though Evelyn had been stitched between two eras, neither fully belonging to the past nor the present. "You must have so many questions," Evelyn said, folding her hands in her lap as they sat in the living room. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed nerves, decades of secrecy pressing behind them. Stella leaned forward, her own voice steadier now. "Are you my mother? Are you Evelyn Hartman?" "Yes," Evelyn replied without hesitation. "I am." The silence that followed was profound. Greer shifted in his chair, his notebook half open, his pen idle. Stella pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to reconcile the impossible. "You look exactly the same," she whispered. "How?" Evelyn exhaled slowly, as though preparing for a confession long rehearsed. "That morning in 1977, she began, "I thought it would be like any other. I made breakfast, I packed your lunch, I tidied the house. Then I checked the mailbox. Inside was a letter, no name, no sender. Just an address in Boston and a message that if I wanted to protect our family, I had to go alone. I thought your father was in danger." Her fingers twisted in her lap, a nervous habit Stella recognized instantly from childhood memories. "I took the bus to Boston, convinced I'd be home by dinner. But instead, I was led into a building where a man introduced himself as Dr. Alden Frost." Her voice faltered, and she paused, gathering strength. "He told me it wasn't about your father at all. It was about me. He said I had inherited something rare, something in my blood they had studied before in my grandmother. They said it could hold the key to slowing illness, to extending life. I wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let me. They told me that if I refused, they could make things very difficult for Robert, for you." Stella's eyes welled with tears. "So you stayed?" "I stayed," Evelyn nodded. 2 days became weeks. Weeks became months. And then I realized I wasn't aging. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Stella blinked hard, trying to comprehend them. "You mean you haven't aged since 1977? Evelyn looked down at her hands, still smooth, unlined. "Yes, whatever they did, whatever treatments they gave me, it stopped time for me. While the world changed, I stayed the same." Stella shook her head, her voice trembling. "Do you know what it was like? Waiting? Growing up without you? Watching Dad set a lamp in the window every night until the day he died? He never stopped believing you'd come back." Evelyn's eyes filled, and her voice broke. "I never stopped wanting to. Not for a single day. But they kept me hidden, studied, moved from place to place. I was not a person to them. I was a project. For a moment, the room was heavy with grief, for time lost, for moments stolen." Then Stella reached forward, taking her mother's eternally young hands in her own aged ones. "I don't care how or why," she whispered. "I just care that you're here now." Evelyn leaned forward, pressing her forehead to her daughter's, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then let's not waste another second." The hours after Evelyn's confession passed in a blur of tea, quiet tears, and the halting rhythm of stories shared. Stella told her mother about her childhood, graduations, birthdays, and the bittersweet joy of raising her own family without the woman she longed to ask for advice. Evelyn listened, grief etched into her still youthful face, as though each memory was both a gift and a wound. In turn, Evelyn described the decades she had endured in confinement, watching the world change through guarded windows and limited glimpses, never certain if she would ever be free. Though their paths had been shaped by loss, sitting across from one another now felt like reclaiming something once thought impossible. The following morning, Thomas Greer returned, accompanied by a trusted lawyer named Sarah Klein. Her role was to help Evelyn establish a legal identity that would allow her to live quietly without attracting unwanted attention. "You've been declared legally deceased since 1982. Sarah explained carefully. "We can't undo that publicly without raising questions you don't want answered. But we can build a new paper trail." Evelyn nodded, her resolve steady. "I don't want headlines or investigations. I only want to be a mother again." That afternoon, Stella's children and grandchildren arrived at the Whitaker house. They had been told only that Stella had uncovered something extraordinary about her mother's disappearance. One by one, they stepped through the doorway, their eyes widening at the sight of Evelyn, who looked more like Stella's younger sister than her mother. The room filled with gasps, tentative embraces, and the cautious wonder of a family suddenly confronted with the impossible. Anna, the granddaughter whose gallery show had sparked this discovery, was the first to speak. "You're her," she said softly, staring in awe. "You're the woman from the photograph." Evelyn smiled through tears. "I'm more than that. I'm your great-grandmother, and I've waited a lifetime to meet you." The grandchildren leaned in, curious and full of questions. What was life like in the 1970s? How had she lived through the years unseen? What did it feel like to stand unchanged while decades passed? Evelyn answered carefully, sharing stories of her youth in Oakridge, of dances, family picnics, and simple routines, offering pieces of a world that felt like history come alive. As evening fell, the family gathered around the dining room table. There were awkward silences, moments of disbelief, and tears shed quietly. But there was also laughter, the kind that comes from recognition, from bonds deeper than time. Evelyn marveled at smartphones, gently cradling one as her great-grandchildren showed her photos and music. In return, she sang softly an old lullaby Stella remembered from childhood, her voice trembling but true, carrying across generations. For the first time in decades, the Hartman family felt whole again, even if the shape of their wholeness defied reason. Later that night, Stella lingered in the guest room, reluctant to leave. "It's strange," she said, watching her mother bring her a cup of tea, "to be the older one now, to have lived an entire life while you stayed the same." Evelyn sat beside her, brushing a silver strand of hair from Stella's forehead. "Time may have marked you more than me, but you've lived it. You've loved, raised a family, left a legacy. I envy that. Don't think for a moment that I've escaped the cost of what was taken." Stella reached for her mother's hand. "Then let's promise each other something. Whatever time we have left together, whether it's years or decades, we won't waste it." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn settled into a quiet rhythm. To outsiders, she was Elizabeth Crane, a distant cousin who bore a remarkable resemblance to Stella's late mother. But within the family, she was Evelyn again. Mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. She attended birthdays, Sunday dinners, even helped plant flowers in Anna's garden, carefully tending the soil as she once had on Maple Street long ago. Though the world might never know her true story, her family did, and that was enough. Stella, though frail, seemed to stand taller with her mother beside her. Neighbors noticed a brightness in her eyes, a lighter step in her walk. For the first time in decades, she no longer felt like the girl at the window waiting for someone who never arrived. Instead, she had found what she thought was lost forever. As Evelyn looked at her daughter, now aged beyond her, she whispered a vow she intended to keep. "I may have missed your childhood, but I will not miss another moment of your life."